Thank you for coming to Stowe today. Before we start about discussing the talk you're going to give tonight, could you just tell us a bit about yourself and your journey at Cambridge?
Yeah, sure. So I might be worth introducing myself. My name's Ralston Clair, and I am a lecturer at Cambridge. I am by background a social historian, but I kind of got lured out of social history by art, really, and particularly by buildings. And so my interest in art and buildings is not a conventional art historian's one, where they're interested in proportion and their interest begins and ends with the object. For me, it's a way into understanding a society. I'm interested in how societies work. And that feeds into the other half of my life, which is that I founded Cambridge's first social sciences spin-out. So you've heard of all the sort of science startups. We started a humanities and social sciences one, and through that we sell research to the private sector and also to some parts of some British government departments. So the two sit together in my work.
And what specifically is that research?
Right, so actually it's an interesting mix of, there's a bit of art history in it, because one of our most recent projects was for Keir Starmer just before the election, because people were making deepfakes of him. So they were doing, I don't know if you've come across this, but synthetic footage of Keir Starmer shouting at people and doing all these kinds of electorally undesirable things. And so we were thinking, how do you insulate a political strategy to stop that from happening? And that suited me down to the ground, because obviously a bit of that is art history, right? Because some of it's images, it's image making. So it's a little bit of a social problem as well. And we did it with a psychologist, because obviously there's a huge amount of behavioural psychology behind that kind of a problem. So yeah, those are the sort of two halves of what I do.
Yeah. And what about your time at Shrewsbury? Inspired
Yeah, amazing. Yeah.
Your career at Cambridge and then your consultancy company.
That's a good question. It's the first time I've been asked about my secondary school. I was immensely lucky. I enjoyed it. I had a huge amount of opportunity. And I did all sorts of things. Listen, it's far too soon really for me to be talking about my school days, because I'm super young, but I got a lot out of it. I think it's been, in some ways though, it is a challenge in terms of working in a lot of institutions now. It's not an altogether, it's an open secret, isn't it, that all of us have to be a bit more conscious of some of the advantages we've had, and it's certainly, you might have to edit this bit out, but yeah, there are drawbacks, I think, but I was very lucky.
So did Shrewsbury or your time at Cambridge, how did that inspire you to get into the field you are today?
Well, this is a lovely thing about Shrewsbury. When I was at school, I used to bunk off and draw churches on a Thursday afternoon. So it sounded like you were going to have to cut that bit as well, but it's a very wholesome story. We snuck out, and I used to go drawing. That was like a thing I liked doing, and yeah, it was lovely. So I started that, and I think I was probably always into it, to be honest with you.
Because your father was a draftsman, was he?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely done your research. Yeah, he's a retired architect. I don't know though. I mean, I think most parents are very interested in persuading their kids not to do what they did, to be honest. So yeah, he's an artist, and so yeah, we were always surrounded by people drawing and being creative, but I wouldn't say that he was sort of explicitly into us doing it, but yeah. Okay. And then ended up doing history. Was always quite interested in that. And yeah, it sort of blossomed from there.
So you're more into like the social factors of architecture. What made you prefer that instead of like the culture?
That's a good question. And I don't think that I'm interested in the social aspects of it at the expense of the culture. And it's always hard to say why we're interested in things, isn't it? Other than that you get some kind of dopamine reward if you're doing something you kind of enjoy. But I think we have to keep the two things together, by the way. There's two extremes you've got to be careful about if you're looking at art or architecture. On the one hand, you can just nerd out on the object itself, as some art historians do, and have no consciousness of what it tells you about the society. And then on the other hand, you've got what I'm at risk of, which is being so interested in what the object tells you about the society that you actually forget to look and appreciate the thing at hand. And that's what a lot of historians do. They go, oh, this is an absolutely fascinating plot, it tells us all about ancient Greece. And they actually don't go, hang on a moment, look at the proportion, look at the cart, you know. So that's the balance you've got to strike.
Yeah.
And what does your consultancy company do?
Well, yeah, we sort of touched on it there for a moment, Hamish, in that I set out to essentially, this was a slightly grand and ridiculous vision, but I felt that the consultancy industry, I have to be very careful because I'm sure some of our viewers will be management consultants, but I felt that it was perhaps, it's pretty substantial industry, it's pretty bloated. There's a kind of general habit of charging £500,000 and then giving you two 21-year-olds. And I thought, what would it be like if we did something with just a couple of us, all of whom were university affiliated, sort of credible academics, either subject specialists or people who would be well placed to find somebody who was really, close to the latest research. So I thought, why don't we do that? Why don't we have a sort of a smaller, more nimble model? That's how it started, and so it started in quite a multidisciplinary way, and it meant that we were able to do things like that project I mentioned earlier, where actually you do need different kinds of expertise on that job, right? You do need psychologists to talk to, historians to talk to, people who know about machine learning. So yeah, quite cross-disciplinary. That said, the root of our work is qualitative research. So we write white papers. We write essays. It's probably the simplest way I could put it.
So was that happening at the same time you were at Cambridge? Were you balancing them at the same time?
Yeah, I'm still trying to balance them. So I'll get back to you on that. This started when the business started when I was doing my PhD at Cambridge. And somebody who I like, I won't name him, but it got quite a prominent communications guy came to me and asked me to work for him. And it's the only time I've ever played anything cool in my whole life. I said, actually, I don't want to do it. And he said, fine, start doing some research for the business that he runs. And that's what that's what started the business, which is at its heart sells research to communications businesses. Because modern comms, as you can imagine in today's digital landscape, is a highly sophisticated thing. And there's a kind of stereotype of PR people I don't want to be rude, but there is a stereotype, and that's not it. It ultimately, at its best, is derived from high quality data, polling, psychological research. We do some polling as well, so that's part of it.
And what was that PhD you did on?
Yeah, that's very kind of you to ask. I'm always very embarrassed by this, because PhDs are by definition, a PhD is something that's never been done before. Yeah. So it's always so fantastically niche, and it makes you sound like a little bit of an anorak. But I wrote a PhD about Victorian Scotland, and I wrote about this moment when, and I'll tell you this, there's a load of big rebellions in Scotland in the 18th century, late 18th century. In the aftermath of this, the British Crown cracks down on Scotland, and they actually make it illegal to do a lot of Scottish things. So it becomes illegal to wear a kilt, for instance. They have a real go at Scottish culture. And then I wrote about the moment in the 19th century, sort of 50 years later, where it begins to come back. But it doesn't just come back as it was, it kind of comes back as part of a romantic movement. So it's a little bit nostalgic, it's a little bit more overdone, if you like, than it was in its original iteration. And that's like the moment, you may know of this, that's about the time that Queen Victoria and Prince Albert get really into being Scottish and start wearing tartan and dancing about the place. So that's the area I was working on. That's a movement that had literature attached to it, people like Walter Scott. That's a point at which, there's a lot of fashion history, so there's obviously the tartan. And there's also a point where there's a lot of architecture, and they start building these very romantic Hogwartsy castles. That's a long-winded way of putting it. My scientific friends just go, he knows about Scottish castles. Yeah. Perhaps so, but I like to think it's much grander and more interesting than that.
Yeah. I was looking at the page Mr. Christie sent over, and you said you did some research into what you'd call rogue architects.
Yeah.
That really interested me.
Yeah. That is my pet topic, Imogen. That's kind of you to ask. Yeah, it's amazing quality of Stoic research here. I wrote about, for my master's degree, this is my MPhil degree at Cambridge, I wrote about a moment in the mid-Victorian period where there were these architects who went a bit off the rails, basically. So you may know, and I don't want to bore your listeners, you may know that the Victorian period was dominated by the Gothic revival, yeah. So, and the guy who led that was a guy called Pugin, who was this crazy, half French, syphilitic, religious, highly religious guy who died in his 40s in a lunatic asylum, but not before he built the Palace of Westminster, House of Parliament, right? Anyway, that's the mainstream. But there were these guys who went off the rails and kind of took the Gothic revival and went, I guess you could almost say it was a bit like steampunk. It's almost like a bit crazy, a bit overdone, a bit. And I don't know, everyone's taste is different. Mine's always been a little bit sort of, a bit marginal. The point at which something's a bit overdone, that's kind of what interests me. When it becomes a bit of a freak show. And maybe that's why I like working in today's media landscape, because it's a bit of a psychodrama sometimes,
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And then focusing more on your talk later, how do you see AI changing the way that we sort of analyse and preserve historical art and architecture?
Right, yeah. So kindly asked me to talk this evening about AI image making. So we'll talk about the development of that from kind of early computer art in the 1960s and how that kind of comes through to where we are now. I'll talk less about, although your question is an interesting one, about how it will change. Do you say sort of how it will change how we look at historic art? Preserving it. Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, because now, I think if you guys go on to do historical art, historical research, the archives and the preservation is still paper-based. And I've wasted a lot of my 20s in archives with it's all very specific, old school. You have your pencil and you do these carbon paper slips. So in some senses, it's very trad, and it'll probably go on like that for a while because there are millions of objects being stored. I suppose one day that will be digitized, but that does depend on the public institutions that look after this stuff being funded, right? I mean, that's a huge philanthropic thing that will take time. In terms of wider preservation, there's a whole heritage aspect to this, and I don't fully know what that looks like. I'm sure there will be all manner of conservation techniques in terms of working out how old things are. I don't know. I mean, that will change. I don't exactly know how. More widely, there's some really exciting resources in terms of public consumption of art and heritage. So you might be familiar with Google Arts and Culture. Again, sadly, somewhat cut back in recent years. Bloomberg Connects. That's like the app that I think is going to change the museum world a little bit. It's really, you guys who are interested in art, really worth downloading that on your phone. You can go to almost any world museum on it and get audio talks, etc.
Oh, wow.
Obviously, that's a sort of broader answer because that's sort of technological rather than explicitly artificial intelligence. And yeah, I don't know. Does that cover some of your question?
Do you think that, say, if you had a painting or a piece of art that was unfinished,
yeah,
do you think that AI could fill in the pieces?
Yeah. Well, it certainly could, but my question to you is: would we want that?
Mm.
Why would we want?
Or
Why would we want?
Say, like something that's damaged.
Yes. Yes. I mean, it absolutely could. But I suppose. But I'll put this to you: reprographic technology has been good enough for decades now to make an absolutely indistinguishable copy of a famous work of art. And so, this is the thing we have to think about, right? Suppose I had real Mona Lisa here and an identical Mona Lisa. What's the difference between the two of them? And which one would we want?
Yeah.
And that's where you get into an interesting discussion about NFTs, right? What does it mean? Non-fungible tokens, and this is when art gets connected with. So don't sound too much like Andrew Tate here, but start talking about cryptocurrency. But an NFT allows you to own the idea of a piece of art without actually owning the physical thing.
And when you say the idea, what do you mean?
You own the you'd buy a piece of art online. You would get the JPEG, and yeah, you could print it out. Other people could have a copy, but you fundamentally would own the copyright of that image.
Okay.
In the same way, it's almost analogous to a situation where, yeah, the Louvre own that painting, but you or I could have an identical copy on our wall.
Yeah.
But in some sense, the reality of it is owned by the French state.
Yeah.
Because anyway, sorry, gets a bit philosophical at this point, but
No, we'll steer away. We're at Stowe.
Yeah.
Mr. Christie tells us that you did some research on Stowe. What does that entail?
yeah, well, Mr. Christie suggested that I do a bit more research at Stowe. It's an exciting place for me. My interest is obviously, as we've sort of touched on, is mainly in the Gothic,
Yeah.
sort of late 18th and early 19th century. And your headmaster, Dr. Wallace Steiner, has obviously this unbelievable study, which is the kind of study envy, really. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And I'm doing a little bit of work on that. Kind of unique, a rare example of sort of Gothic revivalism at Stowe, as you guys will know. It's the work of Sir John Soane, who was one of the great late 18th century architects, architected the Office of Works, and the posthumous founder of the museum in London that bears his name, as you'll be aware. And it's interesting, that study, that library is interesting as being one of the first moments at which people begin to look back to Gothic architecture as a source material. Because obviously for most of that century, as we can see around us, they've been interested in classical architecture and the architecture of classical Europe. And they just begin to look back. And there's several reasons for that. And that movement of looking back to the Gothic kind of gathers pace in the early 19th century when Europe descends into war. And then all of a sudden, what can't you do? What do you have to do to design a classical building? Like, what do all the classical architects do? Do you know?
Sorry.
Like there's this moment when people are designing classical buildings in the Georgian period. What do all the kind of Georgian aristocrats do? What do they all have in common?
Symmetry and pattern.
Yeah, so that's the kind of architectural common theme. But they all have an experience in common. It's a bit like the gap year. They all have a very specific kind of gap year.
Oh, sort of going to...
Yeah, they...
bringing sort of parts back.
Exactly, yeah, there's a trend for sort of the world's most expensive gap year, really. They do a grand tour, it's called the Grand Tour.
Yeah.
They travel around Europe, you might have heard of it,
And sort of bringing back.
And bringing things back, yeah. And then all of a sudden, when there's a massive war in the early 19th century, that becomes harder. And so all of a sudden, and that coincides with sort of interest sort of turning back in to what is our actual national architecture like.
Yeah.
So that's where you've also got, that again is a bit of a social way of seeing art history, right? It's not just about like very dreamy artistic motivations. A big part of it is geopolitically, where can you travel to, right?
And going back to your interest in sort of Gothic architecture, does that stem from your sort of studies into Victorian sort of Scottish?
Yeah, that's a good question. Where does that come from? I don't know. It's the rest thing. It's very gripping. It's very like it's gripping. Oh, sorry, it sounds ridiculous to say it's gripping stuff. It kind of is. When you see these buildings, they're very, very... It's a bit like arriving at Stowe, right? I mean, it's a massive aesthetic experience. And in the same way, look, if you guys have ever like gone to St Pancras Station, right, on the Eurostar, when you come into that massive engine shed, like it's very compelling. It's a very maybe it's attracted to us because Victorian Britain, for all sorts of good and bad reasons, was in its time the wealthiest country in the world, and so it's a very, very confident kind of an architecture. It's a huge amount of confidence to it, in a way that after both wars, culturally not nearly as confident, and possibly for good reason. So yeah, that's kind of how. So yeah, Victorian architecture is gripping. It's meant to be. It's assertive. It's meant to make you believe in the things the Victorian state believed in, many of which we don't now believe in, like empire. And yeah, right you say.
Well, looking forward, is there anything new you're excited to explore about architecture or rising trends that you're excited about, really?
Yeah, that's a good question. Ooh, yes, there is. I am interested in, at the moment, and this is something that's kind of touching on my business, I'm interested in nationalism as being one of the great forces shaping our world at the moment. I needn't refer to all the obvious political events behind that. It's true that I've got a historically informed interest in that, because obviously in my sort of period of specialism I'm working on art and culture that's informed by like national factors, right? So yeah, I do have a historical approach to that, but I'm very interested in its present day appearance. And I'm also, and with that, and it does touch on the projects that come into the business now, I'm very interested in the political consequences of that. I'm very interested in the linked issue of patriotism, and why it is that patriotism, the business of loving your country, has now become associated with the right wing of politics, which seems to me not a necessary thing. So yeah, I realise it probably sounds a bit perverse to be interested in something that in a way is quite such a difficult international story, but it is intellectually very interesting, and I think will be hugely consequential for us politically.
That is really interesting. You should just do one last question.
Yeah, sure.
Any more questions that you want to ask?
Just any advice for people who are interested in, architecture and art history? If you want to tell us anything about getting into something you're really interested in and finding what you're passionate about?
Yeah, sure. Actually, thank you for asking that one, because this is a hobby horse for me, Imogen. I think nationally there's this big crisis of self-confidence in the arts, right? There's this whole like STEM thing.
Yeah.
And I'm not allowed to swear on this podcast. Anyway, you should take no notice of that. The UK's contribution to the global economy, I think, has been overwhelming. Its recent significance has been overwhelmingly cultural. When you consider the amount of music, for instance, English music, the amount of our popular culture that is a global export, and by the way, the effect that has on our geopolitical soft power, it vastly outstrips, say, like our military influence. When you think of British academia, sorry, it sounds a bit like self-aggrandizing, but like leave me out of it. But like, there's a whole load of parts of British arts and culture hugely influential. And there are still jobs there for people who are genuinely interested in them. And the example I've got for you on this is last year my business wrote a white paper about the economic value of UK creativity. And as part of that, we interviewed the guys who came up with ABBA Voyage. Have you guys been? Sensational. And that was actually, by the way, that's invented by Benny Anderson's son. Benny being one of the Bs in ABBA. His son did it, came up with it. And that, by the way, brings in 177 as gross value add in the year we wrote about this, 177 million pounds added to the London economy. Huge partnerships locally with local schools, etc. And I was talking to Ludwig Anderson. I said, look, we've got this massive sort of crisis, not enough arts jobs. And he said, what do you mean? We've just hired 100, no, more than that. I think he actually said 1,000 VFX, visual effects artists. So yeah, think imaginatively.
It's more widespread.
It's much more widespread than you think. Think about UX, user experience design. There are these jobs, but you just kind of have to get out of this. I know it's true at university. Careful what I say, but it is true that traditional universities have this mindset that you all go and work in museums like it's 1890 or something. The public sector's been very cut back since 2010. We all know that. But there are still jobs, and there is grounds for optimism. But yeah, never do it for the sake of it, right?
No, that's great to hear. Well, it's been a pleasure to meet you.
No.
Thank you for coming in.
Great to talk. Thank you.